The silence was the loudest thing in the kingdom of Eredor, a suffocating blanket woven from 7 years of being utterly unseen. For Queen Elara, it was the sound of her own soul gathering dust in the grand, starlit halls of the elven palace. She was a queen of ghosts, a human treaty bound in flesh and blood to a high king who looked through her as if she were made of glass. Every morning she woke with the cold certainty that if she were to vanish, it would be days, perhaps weeks, before anyone noticed the absence of her mortal breath in a court of immortals. This profound loneliness, this crushing weight of being a forgotten bargain, was her only constant companion. It's a feeling that hollows you out from the inside. Let me know in the comments your name, where you're watching from, and what time it is for you, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Her life was a meticulously crafted performance of relevance. She would dress in gowns spun from moonlight and silver, her human hair a stark contrast to the ethereal luminescence of the elves who served her with chilling, perfect courtesy. They moved around her with a grace that felt like a judgment, their ageless eyes holding a polite disdain for her fleeting mortality. She presided over councils where her opinion was never sought, walked through gardens whose ancient magic recoiled from her touch, and slept in a bed vast and cold enough for a tomb. This was her gilded cage, a crown that felt more like a brand, marking her as an outsider, a temporary fixture in an eternal world. She was the human queen, a title that in Eredor was simply another word for prisoner, a symbol of a peace treaty that felt more like a surrender of her entire being. High King Theron was a creature of myth and marble, carved from the very essence of the ancient forests he ruled. From her distant place at the feasting table or across the throne room, Elara watched him, a pillar of serene, unassailable power. His voice, when he spoke, was like the shifting of ancient stones, commanding and absolute. In 7 years, he had never addressed her with anything more than the iciest formality, his gaze sweeping over her without a flicker of recognition. He was the architect of her isolation, the sovereign of her silent suffering. To his people, he was a god, the eternal protector of their realm. To Elara, he was a beautiful, remote star, impossibly bright and entirely out of reach, a constant, painful reminder of the chasm that separated not just their thrones, but their very souls. Beneath the veneer of regal acceptance, a desperate, secret wish festered in Elara's heart. It was not a desire for power, nor a longing for her lost human lands. It was a craving so simple, so fundamentally human, that it felt like a shameful weakness in this world of immortal perfection. She yearned for a single moment of genuine connection, a fleeting glance that saw beyond the political pawn and acknowledged the woman beneath the crown. She dreamed of a touch that was not ceremonial, a word that was not scripted. This hidden vulnerability was her deepest wound, not the absence of love, which she had never expected, but the profound ache of being completely and utterly alone, a decorative object whose only purpose was to be a silent testament to a forgotten promise. Tonight, the oppressive silence of the palace felt different. It was heavier, charged with an unspoken tension that made the very air feel brittle. The starlight filtering through the crystalline windows seemed dimmer, the usual ethereal glow muted and strained. A sudden, unseasonal chill crept through the corridors, a cold that had nothing to do with the night air and everything to do with a deep, primal wrongness. Elara stood by her balcony, her hand pressed against the cold stone, when she heard it. Not the soft, gliding footsteps of an elven servant, but the heavy, urgent tread of a royal guard approaching her chambers. The sound was a discordant note in the flawless symphony of her 7-year confinement, a shattering of the predictable emptiness. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed on her door, a summons that had never come before, promising that her world of silent suffering was about to end. The guard who had knocked was a sentinel of the High Court, his silver armor gleaming with a cold, impersonal light that offered no comfort. He did not speak her name, nor did he offer any explanation. His orders were conveyed through a single, sharp gesture. She was to follow. A knot of ice formed in Ilara's stomach as he led her away from her familiar, lonely wing and toward the royal heart of the palace, a section she had never been permitted to enter. The journey was a silent torment, each step echoing in the vast, crystalline corridors. She passed beneath arches of living wood that seemed to recoil from her human presence, their leaves whispering in a language she could not understand. She felt the weight of 1,000 years of history pressing down on her, the silent judgment of a kingdom that viewed her as a temporary impurity, a fleeting mortal stain on their eternal perfection. She was suddenly 7 years younger, a girl of 17, standing on a windswept cliff overlooking the sea, her hand lost in the cold, clammy grip of her father, the last human king. He had not looked at her as he explained the terms of the treaty. He had looked at the horizon, at the encroaching Elven, ships that were a promise of either salvation or annihilation. "You will be their queen," he had said, his voice hollowed out by defeat. "You will be the bridge that saves us all." She remembered the smell of the salt and the cold, the feeling of being carved into a shape that was not her own. She was not a daughter being married. She was a territory being ceded, a living sacrifice pushed onto an altar to appease a god she did not know, all to buy her people a few more generations of borrowed time. Her deepest emotional wound was not the coldness of her elven husband, but the calculated abandonment by her own kind. On the day she left her homeland, they had thrown flowers at her feet, calling her a savior, a hero. But behind the forced smiles and tearful farewells, she saw the stark, undisguised relief in their eyes. They were grateful that the price of their survival was her life, not theirs. She was a debt paid, a problem solved. This profound sense of being utterly disposable had taken root in her soul, a poison that leached the color from any hope of genuine connection. She had learned the harshest of lessons, that love and affection were currencies of convenience, and she, as a political pawn, had already been spent. To be unseen by Theron was merely a continuation of a life of being seen only for her utility. This was why she never allowed herself the foolish, girlish fantasy of romance. Love, she believed, was a privilege reserved for those who were valued for themselves, not for the peace they could secure or the alliance they represented. To dream of Theron, the magnificent remote king who was the very architect of her gilded cage, felt like a form of madness. He was the embodiment of the ageless, overwhelming power that had brought her own kingdom to its knees. To desire him would be to betray the memory of her home, to forgive the very force that had erased her future. Her heart was a fortress, built not to keep others out, but to imprison her own longings, ensuring they could never become a weakness for her enemies, or for herself to exploit. Yet a treacherous contradiction festered within her. While she despised her role as a political prisoner, a secret, shameful part of her was captivated by the unearthly beauty of Eredor. She found a painful solace in the starlit gardens, in the haunting elven music that drifted through the halls, in the elegant, perfect symmetry of the palace itself. This deep-seated conflict left her perpetually off balance, a captive who had grown to admire the artistry of her cage. Her hidden desire was not for love, but for acknowledgement. She yearned for a single moment where High King Theron would look at her and see not the human treaty, not the symbol of a truce, but Ilara, a woman breathing the same air as him, her existence a reality, not a political footnote. The guard finally halted before a pair of towering obsidian doors, unadorned and imposing, set apart from the crystalline filigree of the main palace. This was the entrance to the High King's private wing, a sanctum so sacred and guarded that its existence was more myth than fact to most of the court. The very air around the doors hummed with a raw, ancient power that made the hair on Ilara's arms stand on end. Without a word, the guard pushed the massive doors inward, revealing a chamber steeped in shadow. He gestured for her to enter, his face a mask of disciplined indifference, and then retreated, leaving her alone on the precipice of the unknown. The silence that followed was heavier and more absolute than any she had ever known. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing glass, Ilara stepped across the threshold. The obsidian doors swung shut behind her with a deep, resonant boom that sealed her inside. The room was stark and vast, dominated by a single immense window that looked out upon a sky where the familiar constellations of Eredor seemed dim and sickly. There, silhouetted against the dying starlight, stood Theron. He was not wearing his crown or the elaborate robes of state, but simple dark clothing that clung to a frame radiating a tension she had never seen. He turned slowly, and for the first time in 7 years, his piercing silver eyes met hers directly. They were not cold or distant. They were blazing with a raw, desperate fire that seemed to scorch the very air between them, a look of such profound and terrifying need that it stole her breath away. His physical presence was overwhelming, a force of nature contained within the stark lines of his body. Stripped of his royal regalia, Theron was no less a king. In fact, the raw power radiating from him was more potent, more untamed than she had ever witnessed. It was in the coiled tension of his shoulders, the hard set of his jaw, and the sheer, unyielding intensity of his gaze that now held her captive. For 7 years, he had been a figure of cold marble, distant and perfect. Now, he was a storm, a raging fire, of desperation that seemed to suck the very air from the chamber. The ancient magic that hummed around him felt frayed at the edges, a wild, dangerous current that made her own mortal heart hammer against her ribs. He was still a being of immense, unassailable power, but for the first time she saw the cracks in his perfect, immortal facade. "The stars are dying, Queen Ilara," he said, and his voice was not the resonant, commanding tone of the throne room. It was a raw, strained sound, like stone grinding against stone, filled with a weariness that seemed to defy his ageless appearance. "They are being consumed, and my kingdom with them. A blight, born from the shadows of a war my ancestors thought they had won, is poisoning the heart of Eredor. It spreads through the soil, withers the ancient forests, and dims the light of the sky. For decades I have held it at bay with my own will, a silent battle fought every waking moment, but my strength is failing." He gestured toward the great window, where the once brilliant constellations now appeared weak and sickly. "The decay accelerates. It is a cancer in the very magic of this land, a darkness that is tied to my own blood." His confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, revealing the profound truth of his own gilded cage. While she had suffered a loneliness of the spirit, he had endured a solitude of power, a burden so immense it could never be shared. He was a god to his people, a symbol of eternal strength and serenity, but that image was a carefully constructed lie. Beneath the crown was a man haunted by the guilt of a failing legacy, terrified of being the last High King to watch his immortal kingdom crumble into dust. His hidden fragility was not a simple weakness, but a chasm of desperation, the profound fear that his entire existence, his very soul, was not enough to save those he was sworn to protect. He was just as much a prisoner of his duty as she was of her treaty, both of them trapped in roles that were slowly eroding their very being. "There is a prophecy," he continued, his silver eyes burning into hers, not with affection, but with a terrifying, calculated need. "An echo from the dawn of our age, whispered only in the most forbidden texts. It speaks of a time when the bloodline of the king becomes a vessel for the blight. It says that the only way to purge the decay is to bind the ancient waning magic of the elves to the raw, untamed fire of a mortal human soul." He took a step closer, the space between them crackling with a desperate, unnerving energy. "For 7 years I have ignored it. I have fought this alone, refusing to see you as anything more than the symbol of a peace I was forced to accept. But I can no longer afford that pride. I do not need the human queen of a forgotten treaty. I need you, Ilara. I need your mortality." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, a revelation far more cruel than his years of silent indifference. Her entire existence in this court had been defined by her otherness, her fleeting human life a mark of inferiority. Now, that very mortality, the source of so much elven scorn, was being presented as a tool, a key to save their eternal realm. He had not summoned her to finally see her, to acknowledge the woman who had lived as a ghost in his palace. He had summoned her because she was a resource he had left untapped, a magical implement he was now desperate enough to use. The crushing weight of being unseen was instantly replaced by the horror of being seen only for her function. She was not a partner or a queen in his eyes. She was a cure, a necessary sacrifice to be made on the altar of his dying kingdom. He saw the understanding dawn in her eyes, the flicker of horror and a fresh wave of pain that tightened her features. His expression hardened, the raw desperation momentarily eclipsed by the unyielding will of a king on the brink of ruin. He could not afford her refusal. The fate of Eredor rested on this single, terrifying moment. "The ancient rite of consummation must be performed," he declared, his voice leaving no room for argument, yet it was threaded with the tremor of a final, desperate plea. "You will become my queen in truth, not just in title. Our magics must be bound, our souls entwined. This is the only way." He stood before her, the magnificent, powerful king brought to his knees by a secret decay, demanding she surrender the last thing she had left, herself, to save the man who had been the architect of her 7-year suffering. A bitter, hollow laugh threatened to escape Ilara's lips, but it died in her throat, strangled by the sheer audacity of his demand. For 7 years, 2,555 days, she had been less than a shadow to him, a piece of political furniture he navigated around with frigid indifference. Now, in the dark of his own desperation, he saw her. He saw her mortality, her humanity, not as a flaw to be disdained, but as a resource to be harvested. The air in the chamber grew thick, charged with the weight of his desperate, burning gaze and her silent, seismic shock. The shift was so violently abrupt, it left her feeling dizzy, as if the very ground beneath her feet had turned to treacherous sand. Her loneliness had been a slow, creeping poison. This sudden, utilitarian need was a dagger thrust directly into the heart of that old wound, twisting with a new and excruciating pain. Theron took another step closer, his immense presence seeming to consume the remaining space between them, a king accustomed to taking what he willed, even when begging. "I understand this is sudden," he stated, the word a gross understatement of the chasm he had just blasted open in her reality. "But you must see there is no other path. The prophecy is absolute. It calls for the union of sun and star, the fleeting, fiery warmth of a mortal soul to rekindle the fading light of the elven line. For 7 years I have shielded you from this. I kept you separate, isolated, believing I could spare you the burden and conquer this darkness alone. It was not scorn that kept me from your side, Queen Elara. It was pride, a foolish, arrogant pride that has now brought my kingdom to the very edge of oblivion. I was wrong, and my failure now puts us all at risk." The fire of long-suppressed fury finally ignited within Elara, burning away the icy shock. Her voice, when she found it, was not the quiet, measured tone of the forgotten queen, but a low, trembling thing, sharp with the jagged edges of her pain. "You spared me nothing," she whispered, the words cutting through the tense silence. "You buried me alive. You left me in a beautiful tomb to be stared at by immortals who wished I would crumble to dust faster. Do you have any idea what it is to be a ghost in your own life? To scream and have no one hear you? You speak of your pride, but what you mean is your convenience. I was a problem. You chose to ignore. Now your kingdom is dying, and you have suddenly remembered the name of the tool you left to rust in the corner. Why should I be your cure? Give me one reason why I should sacrifice the very soul you never bothered to see to save a world that never wanted me." His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along the sharp line of his cheek. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of something unreadable, shame perhaps, or even regret, crossed his silver eyes before the iron mask of the king slammed back into place. He did not offer apologies or platitudes, which she knew would have been lies. Instead, he met her anger with a brutal, unvarnished truth that was, in its own way, more compelling. "Because without Eredor, your own world is defenseless," he stated, his voice devoid of warmth but ringing with cold, hard logic. The peace treaty was not a gesture of goodwill. It was a desperate bargain to hold back far greater threats than my armies. The ancient evils that this blight is reawakening will not stop at my borders. They will sweep over your human lands and consume everything. I am not offering you a choice between saving my kingdom or abandoning it. I am offering you a choice between a shared fight for survival and a mutual annihilation. Your sacrifice will not just save Eredor, it will be the shield that protects the memory of your home." He raised a hand, not to touch her, but to indicate the whole of the palace beyond the obsidian walls. "Agree to this, and you will be a ghost no longer. You will be my queen in every sense of the word. You will sit at my right hand, and your voice will carry the weight of my own in the council. The whispers and the scorn will end, for your mortality will be revered as the very source of our salvation. I will grant you access to our libraries, our histories, our magic. You will command the respect you have been denied, and you will wield power that no human has ever touched. I offer you a legacy, Elara, not as a forgotten bargain, but as the queen who saved the stars themselves. Your name will be sung by my people for 10,000 years. I am offering you the chance to finally, truly be seen by everyone." The offer hung in the air, a breathtaking, poisoned tapestry of everything she had ever secretly yearned for. Power, respect, a purpose beyond being a silent effigy of peace. He was offering to transform her gilded cage into a throne, to turn the brand of her mortality into a crown of glory. The sigh, temptation was a potent, insidious thing, coiling in the pit of her stomach. To accept would mean surrendering herself to an intimacy with the architect of her suffering, a man who had broken her spirit through sheer, unrelenting neglect. It would mean binding her life force to his, becoming inextricably linked to the very being who represented her profound isolation. It was a devil's bargain, a promise of light that required her to step willingly into the heart of her own personal darkness, a darkness that wore the face of a king. A strange, chilling calm settled over her. The turmoil of anger and pain receded, replaced by a crystalline, sharp-edged clarity. She looked at the High King of Eredor, at this magnificent, desperate creature brought to his knees not by an enemy army, but by a rot within his own blood. For the first time, she was not looking up at him from a position of utter powerlessness. The scales had shifted. He needed her. his immortal kingdom, his legacy, his very life. It all hinged on the will of the mortal girl he had tried so hard to forget. The realization was not triumphant, it was terrifying, a weight of responsibility as heavy as any crown. But within that terror, a new strength took root. She would not be a passive sacrifice. If she was to be his salvation, it would be on her own terms. "I accept," she said, and the two words fell into the silence with the finality of a gavel. Theron's composure almost broke. A wave of palpable relief washed over him, softening the brutal tension in his frame. But Ilara held up a hand, her gaze as unyielding as his had ever been. The calm in her voice was more formidable than her earlier anger. "I will perform the rite. I will bind my soul to yours and become the queen you need me to be. I will help you save this kingdom." She paused, letting the weight of her acquiescence settle before delivering the final, crucial blow. "But I have one condition. Before the rite, you will take me to the Weeping Falls, in the heart of the Silverwood, and there, with no crowns and no titles between us, you will tell me her name. The name of the elven woman you loved, whose memory has been a shadow in my bed for 7 years. I will not be a replacement for a ghost. I demand to know the truth of the heart I am being asked to save." The announcement was not a request, but a decree delivered with the force of an avalanche. In the grand throne room, under the silent gaze of the celestial map frescoed on the ceiling, High King Theron stood and declared that the 7-year period of ceremonial union was over. He was taking Queen Ilara as his wife in truth, binding their houses and their futures in a sacred rite to be performed at dusk. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled elven nobility, a sound like the shattering of fine crystal. Lord Valerius, his ancient face a mask of aristocratic disdain, watched from the council seats, his eyes narrowing to silver slits. He saw not a king solidifying his reign, but a desperate man defiling his bloodline. Ilara, standing beside the throne where she had been invisible for so long, felt the weight of 1,000 hostile stares. She was no longer a ghost. She was a target, and the cold resolve in her heart was the only armor she possessed. The ceremony was an affair of stark, ancient power, devoid of celebration. It was conducted in the starlit sanctum, a chamber open to the sky where the very air hummed with dormant magic. Ilara wore a simple gown of unadorned white silk, a deliberate choice that emphasized her fragile, fleeting humanity against the eternal stone and living wood of the sanctum. The elven lords and ladies who were forced to attend watched her with a mixture of morbid curiosity and undisguised contempt. Theron stood opposite her, clad not in royal gold, but in the dark, severe robes of a high priest, his presence as imposing and unyielding as the mountains that ringed the kingdom. He looked less like a groom and more like a sorcerer about to perform a perilous, world-altering ritual, his silver eyes fixed on her with an intensity that was both terrifying and absolute. This was not a wedding, it was a forging, and she was the mortal metal about to be plunged into immortal fire. The vows they exchanged were not promises of love or fidelity, but of shared purpose and mutual sacrifice. Theron spoke first, his voice resonating with the deep, foundational magic of Eredor itself. He spoke in the ancient elven tongue, words that felt like the grinding of mountains and the whisper of primordial forests, binding his power to their union for the preservation of the realm. When it was her turn, Ilara spoke in the common tongue, her voice clear and steady, a shocking note of mortal defiance in the sacred space. She did not promise to obey or to cherish. She promised to endure. She pledged her mortal fire to his fading light, her fleeting life to his eternal burden. It was an oath of allies facing a common enemy, a Stark and brutal contract, recited before a horrified court that had expected the submissive platitudes of a political bride, not the steely declaration of an equal partner in a desperate war. The reaction from the court was a silent, simmering storm of outrage. Lord Valerius's faction of purist nobles stood rigid, their faces carved from ice, their contempt a palpable force in the sanctum. To them, this was the ultimate sacrilege. The High King was not just elevating a human, he was binding their sacred waning magic to a creature of mud and dust, a short-lived being whose very presence was a stain on their perfect, eternal world. Whispers slithered through the assembled crowd like venomous snakes, speculating on the king's sanity, on the nature of the blight that had clearly weakened his mind. Elara felt their scorn like 1,000 tiny needles, a fresh wave of the social humiliation she had endured for years, now magnified and sharpened into a public threat. She was no longer just an unwanted queen. She was a blasphemy, a focal point for all their fear and hatred. As the rite dictated, Theron had to place the circlet of union upon her head. It was a delicate thing woven from living silverwood branches and motes of captured starlight, cool to the touch. As he lowered it, his long, elegant fingers brushed against the skin of her temple. The contact was meant to be ceremonial, fleeting, but a violent jolt of energy arced between them, silent and invisible to all but themselves. It was not a spark of affection, but a raw, untamed current of pure magic, a shocking recognition between their two disparate life forces. Elara's breath hitched in her throat, a tiny, involuntary gasp. She saw a flicker of stunned surprise in Theron's guarded silver eyes before his mask of regal composure slammed back into place. The bond they were forging was already alive, a wild and unpredictable power awakening between them, independent of their cold, calculated bargain. The culmination of the rite was a kiss, a public seal on their binding vows. The entire court held its breath, watching with a predatory stillness. Theron leaned down, his movements as deliberate and controlled as ever, but Elara could feel the slight tremor in the air around him, a sign of the immense power he was struggling to contain. His lips met hers, and the world seemed to fall away. The kiss was not tender or passionate, it was elemental. It was the taste of ancient stone and starlight, the cold fire of his immortal essence meeting the raw, untamed warmth of her mortal soul. For a single blinding moment, the fading stars visible through the sanctum's open roof blazed with renewed intensity. It was less a kiss and more a cataclysm, a branding of her very being that left her shaken to her core, the promise of their pact now a terrifying, undeniable physical reality. They broke apart, the air between them crackling with a residual energy that made the hair on Elara's arms stand on. The court was utterly silent, stunned into submission by the raw display of power they had just witnessed. Theron turned to face them, his hand protectively hovering near Elara's back, in the first gesture of public defense she had ever received from him. His voice rang with an unchallengeable authority that silenced the whispers before they could even begin. "Behold Elara, Queen of Eredor in truth," he declared, his gaze sweeping over the nobles, daring any of them to object. "My wife, her fire is now the heart of this kingdom, and her light will be our shield against the encroaching dark." The words were a warning to his court, but his eyes briefly met hers, and in their depths she saw not the cold calculation of a king, but the profound, desperate relief of a drowning man clinging to his last hope. The procession from the sanctum was a new form of exquisite torture. For the first time, she walked beside him, not as a distant accessory but as his equal, their steps echoing in unison on the crystalline floors, The proximity was suffocating. She was intensely aware of every detail of his presence, the immense contained power radiating from him, the faint, clean scent of pine and cold night air, the way the dark fabric of his robes moved around a frame built with lethal grace. He did not touch her, yet the space between them felt more intimate and charged than any physical contact. The eyes of the entire elven court followed them, a heavy weight on her shoulders. In the space of an hour, she had been transformed from a forgotten relic into the most controversial and powerful figure in the kingdom, and the loneliness of her old life was swiftly being replaced by the terror of her new one. Just before they reached the branching corridors that would lead to their separate wings, a twist in the path left them momentarily alone, shielded from view by a sweeping arch of living crystal. The crushing weight of what they had just done descended upon them in the sudden silence. Theron stopped and turned to her, his regal mask slipping to reveal the profound exhaustion beneath. "The rite is sealed," he said, his voice low and stripped of its public formality, sounding almost strained. "The first step is taken. At dawn, we ride for the Weeping Falls. I have not forgotten my part of our bargain." The words were a stark reminder that this new reality, this shocking public union, was still fundamentally a transaction. It was a promise not of a shared future, but of a debt that had yet to be paid, grounding her in the cold truth that she was his salvation, but not yet his partner. As he prepared to turn and leave her, his hand, as if possessing a will of its own, brushed against hers. The contact was a fleeting, accidental whisper of skin against skin, yet it sent a searing bolt of lightning through her entire body. It was a shock of pure, unadulterated magic, 100 times more potent than the ceremonial touch in the sanctum. Theron froze instantly, his entire body going rigid, and snatched his hand back as if he had been burned by a hot iron. Ilara stared down at her own hand, her heart hammering against her ribs as a phantom heat spread up her arm. That touch had not been an accident. It was an instinct, a raw magnetic pull from the bond they had just forged. In that one uncontrolled moment, a terrifying new truth became clear to them both. This was no longer just an agreement. It was a living, breathing force, and it was already escaping their control. The days that followed the rite were a study in fragile, unspoken truce. Ilara now resided in the Queen's chambers, adjoining the King's private wing, a territory of obsidian and starlight she had never before seen. Their mornings were spent in a shared solar, taking their first meal in a silence that was profoundly different from the chasm of the past 7 years. This was not a silence of neglect, but a charged, watchful quiet, thick with the awareness of the bond that now thrummed between them. She watched the way he held his silver goblet, the subtle tension in his long fingers, and felt a strange, unnerving pull, a magnetic hum in her own blood that responded to his proximity. It was the magic of their union, a living entity in the space between them, and it was both a comfort and a constant, terrifying reminder of the bargain she had made. One evening, seeking refuge in the Royal Library, a place she now had unrestricted access to, she was poring over a dusty tome of human history, a relic from her own forgotten world. She was so engrossed that she didn't hear him approach until his shadow fell across the page. Theron stood there, his expression unreadable, his silver eyes fixed on the book. "The Wars of the Crimson Plains," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Your ancestor, Queen Anya the Valiant, led the final charge herself, a reckless strategy for a monarch." Ilara looked up, stunned that he not only knew of the book, but of her history. "It was the only way they could win," she replied softly. He simply nodded, a flicker of something akin to respect in his gaze. "Indeed, courage is not a uniquely elven trait." The small acknowledgement, the first of its kind, felt more significant than any royal decree. This new proximity allowed her to see the cracks in his marble facade. She began to notice the faint lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, visible only in the quiet moments when he believed no one was watching. She saw the way he would. Sometimes press the heels of his hands to his temples, a gesture of immense hidden pain. He was not just a king fighting a blight. He was a man holding back an ocean of decay with his bare hands, and the strain was slowly eroding him from within. Her resentment, the bitter companion of 7 years, began to feel complicated, muddied by a nascent, unwelcome sympathy. She was tied to this man, this suffering king, and the realization that his battle was now her own was a heavy, suffocating weight. She was beginning to see the prisoner behind the crown, a reflection of her own gilded cage. Their fragile peace was shattered during a meeting of the High Council. They convened to discuss the failing magical wards at the kingdom's northern border, a direct consequence of the spreading blight. Ilara sat beside Theron on a smaller yet equal throne, a placement that drew the venomous glares of the purist faction. Lord Valerius, his face a mask of cold fury, rose to speak. He did not address the failing wards directly, but instead turned his icy gaze on Ilara. "High King," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "while we appreciate your renewed devotion to the Queen, one must question the wisdom of placing matters of ancient elven magic in the hands of a creature whose own life is but a fleeting breath. Her very presence in this sacred chamber is a distraction. What can a short-lived human possibly comprehend of the eternal struggle we face?" The insult was a physical blow, sharp and public, designed to strip her of any legitimacy. The air in the council chamber grew frigid. Ilara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, her hands clenching into fists in the folds of her gown. She wanted to shrink, to become the ghost she once was, but she forced herself to meet Valerius's gaze, her chin held high, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The other nobles watched, their faces a mixture of cruel satisfaction and nervous anticipation, waiting to see how the king would respond to this direct challenge, not just to his wife, but to his own judgment. For a terrifying moment, she feared he would say nothing, that he would let the humiliation stand as a political necessity, sacrificing her dignity for the sake of a fragile peace within his own council. Theron did not move. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned his head slowly, and the full, undivided weight of his ancient, formidable power fell upon Lord Valerius. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Lord Valerius," he said, and his voice was not loud, but it was a blade of sheer, frozen authority that cut through the silence. "You forget yourself. Queen Ilara's mortality is not a weakness. It is a fire, a potent force you cannot comprehend, and it is the very thing that will serve as the crucible for our kingdom's renewal. Her comprehension is not the issue here. Yours is. You will address her with the respect she is owed as your queen, or you will not address her at all, and you will find yourself guarding the very failing wards you speak of from the outside. Make your choice." The threat was absolute, delivered with a chilling finality that left no room for argument. A stunned, deathly silence descended upon the council. Lord Valerius, who had stood proud and defiant moments before, seemed to physically shrink under the king's wrath. His face, usually a mask of aristocratic disdain, was pale with shock and a dawning fear. He bowed his head, a stiff, jerky motion of submission. "My apologies, Your Majesty." "My queen," he ground out, the last 2 words tasting like ash in his mouth. The other lords shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting from the humiliated Valerius to the impassive king, and then to Ilara. In that moment, she was no longer just the human bride. She was the king's chosen, a figure to be feared, protected by a power none of them dared to cross. Theron had not just defended her. He had publicly forged her authority in the fires of his own, and the entire court had been forced to bear witness. Later, in the privacy of their chambers, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly ebbed away, leaving a thick, charged silence in its wake. The grand display of power in the council room felt a world away, and now there was only the two of them, standing on opposite sides of the room, caught in the undertow of what had just occurred. Ilara's heart was still beating too fast. He had defended her. He had shielded her with his own power, publicly and without hesitation. The act was so contrary to the 7 years of cold indifference that she struggled to process it. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper, feeling the inadequacy of the words. He turned from the window, where he had been staring out at the dimming stars, his silver eyes meeting hers with an unnerving intensity. He crossed the room in 3 long, silent strides, stopping just before her. The space between them crackled with an energy that was no longer just the hum of their magical bond, but something far more complex and personal. "Valerius's insolence was a threat to the crown," he stated, his voice low, as if trying to frame his actions in purely political terms. But his eyes told a different story. "He was wrong to speak to you that way." Gently, almost hesitantly, he reached out, and his fingers brushed against her arm, a deliberate gesture of comfort. The touch was brief, but it sent a wave of warmth through her that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the simple, profound shock of a human connection she had long since given up on. It was a gesture that said more than his words ever could. That night, sleep would not come. Ilara lay in the vast, silk-draped bed, the phantom sensation of his touch still lingering on her skin. She replayed the events of the day in her mind, the sting of Valerius's humiliation, the cold, protective fury in Theron's voice, the stunned silence of the council, and the quiet, almost gentle moment in their chambers. The lines of their arrangement, once so clear and stark, were beginning to blur into an incomprehensible tangle of duty, magic, and something else. Something fragile and terrifyingly real. A question bloomed in the darkness of her mind, a dangerous seed of hope she had sworn never to plant. Are we only pretending? The thought was a betrayal of every wall she had built around her heart, a whisper that perhaps this desperate alliance was becoming something neither of them had ever intended. Her restless thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of the door, connecting their chambers opening. Theron stood silhouetted in the doorway, his regal bearing replaced by a somber gravity that made her heart clench with a sudden, inexplicable dread. He had not come to her chambers since that first, desperate night. "The bond is holding," he said, his voice quiet but strained. "But it is not stable. The magic we have woven is a shield, but it is not a cure. It needs an anchor, something to root it to the very heart of Eredor, or it will eventually fray and unravel under the strain of the blight." He stepped fully into the room, his silver eyes finding hers in the dim starlight, and the look in them was one of grim, unavoidable truth. The next step of their bargain was upon them, and she knew, with a sinking certainty, that it would demand far more of her than she had ever imagined. He came to stand by her bed, his presence immense and overwhelming in the intimate quiet of the room. He looked down at her, the High King of Eredor, his power and his desperation warring in his gaze. "The prophecy is explicit," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, heavy with the weight of the words he was about to speak. "To purge the decay, The union of sun and star must not only bind their magic, but create a new vessel for it. A focal point where our joined power can settle and grow, becoming a new wellspring of life for the land itself. He paused, letting the implications sink into the charged air between them. "Elara," he said, and the use of her name was both a plea and a decree, "the bond is not enough. To save this kingdom, we must conceive an heir." The demand landed in the silent chamber with the force of a physical execution, severing the fragile, tentative thread that had begun to weave itself between them. Elara felt the blood drain from her face, a chilling cold, seeping into her bones that had nothing to do with the night air. An heir, a vessel, an anchor. He had used different words, but they all meant the same thing. Her body was just another resource, a plot of fertile ground in which to plant the salvation of his kingdom. Every moment of connection, every shared glance, every act of public defense now felt like a calculated lie, a careful grooming of the sacrifice. She was not his partner, she was his broodmare. The chasm that had defined the first. 7 years of their marriage yawned open once more, wider and more terrifying than ever before, because this time she had foolishly allowed herself to stand at its edge, believing they might learn to build a bridge across it. Theron saw the flicker of hope in her eyes extinguish, replaced by a profound, familiar agony that twisted his own gut with a guilt so sharp it was difficult to breathe. He took a half-step forward, his hands clenched at his sides, fighting the instinct to reach for her. "It is not what you think," he began, his voice strained, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "The prophecy is not a mere suggestion, Elara. It is a timeline, a death sentence for Eredor. The blight, it is accelerating. The magic we wove in the sanctum, this bond between us, it is a raging fire. Without an anchor, a new life to ground it in the soil of this world, it will burn itself out. It will consume us both, starting with you. It will drain your mortal life force within a year, leaving me a hollowed-out shell for the darkness to finally inhabit. This is not a choice. It is the only way to prevent the bond from becoming your funeral pyre." His explanation was meant to be a plea for understanding, but it landed as the ultimate betrayal. He had known, from the moment he had come to her chambers that desperate night, he had known this bond could kill her. He had watched her lower her defenses, had accepted her trust, had even defended her in his counsel, all while withholding the most crucial, terrifying truth. She was not just a tool, she was a tool with an expiration date. A bitter, soundless laugh caught in her throat. "So, the choice was never between saving your kingdom or letting it fall," she whispered, her voice trembling with a resurrected fury. "It was between my slow death by your neglect or my fast death by your design. You have always seen me as a sacrifice. You just became more efficient about it. How dare you stand here and pretend any of this was for me? You have been fattening the lamb for the slaughter." Pushed to the absolute brink by the truth in her accusation, a crack finally appeared in Theron's immortal composure. His face, usually a mask of serene control, crumpled with a raw human anguish that stunned her into silence. "Because I was a coward," he roared, the sound echoing in the chamber, raw and full of self-loathing. "I hid the full truth because I could not bear to speak it. When I saw what this bond was doing, how it was making you shine from within, I told myself we would find another way, but there is no other way." He moved closer, his silver eyes blazing with a desperate, unsanctioned fire. "When Valerius spoke to you with such contempt, the fury I felt had nothing to do with the crown. It was not a king who wanted to strike him down. It was the man. I am terrified of what this will cost you, Elara, more than you can ever know. But I am more terrified of a world without you in it, consumed by a darkness I was too weak to stop." Her heart fractured at the confession, a devastatingly beautiful sentiment wrapped in an unforgivable lie. The raw pain in his voice was real. She could feel it, a testament to the agonizing conflict raging within him. But trust, once so thoroughly broken, could not be pieced back together with a few desperate, beautiful words. The foundation of their fragile alliance had been built on a lie of a mission so profound it tainted every memory, every shared moment, every flicker of hope. "Your terror doesn't change what you have done," she said, her voice flat and devoid of the fire he had just witnessed, a sign of a deeper, more permanent wound. "You talk of a world without me, but you have never known a world with me in it. You have only ever known a world with my function, and I will not, be the cure for a kingdom that has only ever been my poison." The impasse was absolute, a silent, agonizing standoff in the heart of the dying kingdom. Before, the suffocating silence could completely consume them. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed from the grand doors of their chambers. The sound was an intrusion from the outside world, a brutal reminder that their private war was about to be interrupted. A royal herald, his face grim and his posture rigid, entered and bowed low. "Your Majesties," he announced, his voice ringing with an urgency that promised further disaster. "An emergency session of the High Council has been called. It is to convene at once in the Grand Hall." Theron's head snapped up, his private anguish instantly replaced by the cold mask of the king. He looked at Elara, his eyes conveying a new, immediate dread. "Who called it?" he demanded. The herald hesitated for a fraction of a second before delivering the final blow. "It was summoned by Lord Valerius, Your Majesty. He claims to have a matter of grave importance concerning the succession and the very soul of Eredor to bring before the court." The Grand Hall was a cavern of glacial silence and suspended judgment. Every noble of the High Court was present, their silver and white robes a stark contrast to the oppressive gloom that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the palace, a physical manifestation of the Blight's hold. They had not been summoned for a council, but for a tribunal. Lord Valerius stood before the twin thrones, his posture radiating a triumphant, venomous confidence. He was a predator who had finally cornered his prey. Theron and Elara entered, a unified front of obsidian and starlight. A wave of hostile whispers followed them like the rustle of dry, dead leaves. Elara felt the familiar sting of 1,000 judging eyes, but this time it was different. She was not a ghost cowering in the shadows. She was a queen walking into battle, and the man beside her, for all his silent desperation, was still her king. The air was thick with the promise of a final, brutal confrontation that would either shatter their world or remake it entirely. Lord Valerius let the silence stretch, savoring his moment before he struck. "High King Theron," he began, his voice a silken blade that sliced through the tension. "For months we have watched our kingdom wither. You have told us nothing, hiding behind a sudden and convenient affection for your human queen. But the truth has its own light." He turned, his gaze sweeping over the assembled court. "Our king is cursed. The blight is not a plague upon the land, but a rot. Within his own bloodline, a legacy of weakness he has desperately concealed. And this ritual," he spat the word, gesturing to Elara with undisguised contempt, "is not our salvation. It is a blasphemy. He seeks to infect us all, to dilute our ancient magic with the tainted, fleeting life of a mortal. She is not a cure. She is the final symptom of his disease, a desperate bargain that will be the death of us all." The accusation landed with the force of a death knell, a perfectly crafted truth, weaponized into a devastating lie that incited gasps of horror and fear from the assembled lords. Before Theron could unleash the royal fury that was gathering in his eyes like a storm, Elara moved. She took a single step forward, a small movement that commanded the attention of the entire hall. The ghost was gone, replaced by a woman forged in the fires of loneliness and desperation. "Lord Valerius is right about one thing," she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating with a power that stunned the court into silence. The king hid the truth. He bore this burden alone for decades, a silent, solitary war to protect you all. He did not want to cause the very fear you now spread like poison. She turned her gaze from Valerius to the sea of uncertain faces. "But he is wrong about me. I am not a symptom, I am a choice. I am a mortal woman who chose to bind my fire to his fading light, to stand with him against the dark when all of you were content to whisper in the shadows. My mortality is not a taint. It is the spark this kingdom has forgotten it needs. It is the courage to fight for a dawn you are not guaranteed to see." Theron watched her, a maelstrom of shock, awe, and a love so fierce it physically hurt. Her strength, her defiance, her absolute belief in them shattered the last of his prideful defenses. He stepped forward to stand beside her, taking her hand in his, their fingers lacing together in a gesture of unbreakable unity. He looked not at Valerius, but at his people, his silver eyes blazing with the raw, unshielded truth of his soul. "She is right," he confessed, his voice ringing with a power that was not of a king, but of a man laying his heart bare. "I was a fool. For 7 years, my pride and my fear kept me from the greatest strength this kingdom has ever known. I was blinded by my duty, and in doing so, I failed the woman who was my destiny." He turned his gaze to Ilara, his voice softening for her alone, though the whole court heard it. "The prophecy did not force my hand. It only opened my eyes to what my heart already knew. I do not need you to save my kingdom, Ilara. I need you to save me. I love you, not as a cure, but as the very sun my soul has orbited in darkness for far too long." As he spoke the words, a profound shift occurred. The bond between them, no longer a secret ritual but a publicly declared love, erupted into a visible force. A wave of warm, golden light pulsed outward from their joined hands, a silent, radiant explosion that swept through the grand hall. The oppressive chill of the blight receded as if burned away by a sudden dawn. The sickly, dim light filtering through the high crystalline windows intensified, becoming bright and pure. The very stones of the palace seemed to hum with a renewed, vibrant energy. The elven lords and ladies gasped, shielding their eyes from the radiant display, feeling the clean, life-giving magic wash over them. In front of the entire court, Theron leaned down and sealed his confession with a kiss. Not the elemental, cataclysmic kiss of the rite, but one of profound, soul-deep tenderness and absolute devotion. It was a promise made, a destiny accepted, and a kingdom reborn in a single, breathtaking moment. Months later, standing on a balcony overlooking a kingdom vibrant with new life, Ilara leaned back against Theron's chest. The silverwood was lush and green once more, and the night sky was a tapestry of brilliant, healthy stars. The peace they had fought for was not a fragile truce, but a deep, resonant harmony that flowed from the land itself, anchored by their love. Theron's hand rested protectively on her still, flat stomach, a silent acknowledgement of the new life growing within her, the air that was not a magical anchor but a cherished symbol of their future. He had looked through her for 7 years, seeing only a treaty, but now his gaze saw his entire world. She was no longer a ghost in his palace. She was the heart of his home, the sun to his star, forever bound in an orbit of their own making. Their story was a testament to how the deepest wounds can forge the most unbreakable love. If their journey to find each other has touched your heart, show your support by liking this video, commenting on your favorite moment, and subscribing to our channel for more tales of epic love.